David and Mark Granger once shared everything: meals, memories, and a childhood shaped by struggle. But beneath the surface of brotherhood, resentment brewed like a slow-burning fuse. When their older brother Thomas threatened to sell the family home, that fuse ignited, leading to a crime so calculated, so cold, it shocked even the quiet town of Ashton Hills. By the time the truth came out, blood had been spilled, trust destroyed, and the strongest bond of all, family, left in ruins. Ashton Hills was the kind of place where front porches stayed swept, mailboxes stood unbent, and everyone waved at each other whether they meant it or not. It was a small, tree-lined town where trouble rarely knocked. But in July of 2019, that peace shattered in a way no one could have imagined. The morning sun had just started warming the sidewalks when a jogger taking his usual route around Lake Bryan noticed two large duffel bags tossed awkwardly in the weeds near the shore. At first glance, it looked like someone had dumped camping gear or maybe old clothes. But something about the way they were stuffed, bulging and misshapen, made him stop. A sour smell lingered in the air, and flies hovered low over the bags. He called the police, his voice shaking. Officers arrived within minutes and quickly secured the area. What they found inside those bags would haunt everyone involved. Human remains, carefully wrapped in layers of plastic and sealed with industrial tape, were packed inside. The body had been dismembered, the parts distributed between the two bags in a deliberate, clinical manner. The horror of the scene was only magnified by the quiet beauty of the lake surrounding it. It was the kind of place where people brought picnic baskets and children fed ducks. Now it was a crime scene. Forensic teams spent hours combing the area, documenting every inch. There were no obvious signs of a struggle nearby. No tire tracks. No personal belongings left behind. The disposal seemed calculated, almost professional. Initial attempts to identify the victim were difficult due to the condition of the body, but within days, dental records confirmed what some already feared. The remains belonged to Thomas Granger, a well-known local handyman who had been missing. For nearly 3 weeks, Thomas's disappearance hadn't set off alarm bells at first. He often took odd jobs out of town and sometimes went days without checking in. But as time dragged on and phone calls went unanswered, his absence started to feel strange. Neighbors remembered seeing him last working on a roof 2 blocks away. After that, nothing. His car remained parked in his driveway, and his mail began to pile up. Some thought he might have left town quietly, but no one expected this ending. Word spread through Ashton Hills like wildfire. Shock gave way to speculation. Who would want to hurt Thomas? He wasn't known to have enemies. He kept to himself mostly, was polite, and always willing to lend a hand. The idea that someone would kill him, let alone dispose of his body in such a gruesome way, was unthinkable. The police launched a full investigation. They questioned neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who might have had recent contact with him. In a town so small, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. But as days passed and leads grew cold, investigators realized this wasn't going to be a straightforward case. What they didn't know yet was that the answers they were looking for were closer than they could imagine, tied not to strangers, but to Thomas's own blood. Thomas Granger had always been a fixture in Ashton Hills. With his weathered hands and quiet smile, he was the kind of man people called when they needed a fence mended or a leaky roof patched. But behind the calm demeanor and calloused fingers was a complicated family history that few in town truly knew. He was the eldest of 3 brothers, all raised in the same creaky 2-story home on Birch Lane. That house, with its chipped paint and overgrown garden, had been passed down from their parents, and over the years, it became the center of growing tension. David, the middle brother, had a reputation. Not the kind that got whispered about in backyards, but one that raised eyebrows just enough to be noticed. He'd been arrested a few times, shoplifting, bar fights, and a car theft charge that never stuck. He drifted from job to job and was known for short tempers and quick apologies. Mark, the youngest, was quieter, almost invisible to the neighborhood. He worked long hours at a local auto shop, kept his head down, and didn't socialize much. Most people barely remembered what he looked like, Even though he lived only a few blocks away, the three brothers had grown up under the same roof but taken very different paths. Their father had been a hard man, stern and unforgiving. Their mother, kind but frail, passed away from cancer when they were still young. After that, Thomas tried to hold things together, often stepping into a role that wasn't his to carry. He helped raise David and Mark as best he could, but resentment built over time. As adults, that resentment turned into silence. They barely spoke in recent years, only meeting for birthdays or when legal matters forced them to sit in the same room. When Thomas disappeared, neither brother reported it. That struck investigators as odd. Most families, even those with strained ties, would reach out when a sibling vanished. But David told police he just assumed Thomas had taken off. Mark said he thought Thomas was working out of town again. Neither seemed particularly alarmed. That lack of concern set off quiet alarms with the detectives. Soon, questions began to form around the family's old house. It had remained in Thomas's name after their parents passed, even though all three brothers had lived there at different times. A few months before his death, Thomas had started the process of selling it. According to one neighbor, he mentioned moving out of Ashton Hills altogether. The house was falling apart, and he said he was tired of the past hanging over him. But that decision didn't sit well with David or Mark. Selling the house meant letting go of the last connection to their parents, a connection that, despite their fractured bond, still seemed to matter to them. Investigators began looking harder at David and Mark. Their timelines were vague. Their stories didn't line up, and neither had a convincing explanation for where they were the night Thomas likely died. What began as a tragic discovery by the lake was now pointing in a direction that no one in town wanted to believe. This may have been a family affair gone horribly wrong. The investigation into Thomas Granger's murder took a sharp turn just 2 weeks after his remains were found. Up until that point, detectives had struggled to piece together a timeline. There were no witnesses, no security footage near the lake, and the few fingerprints on the bags were smudged and unreadable. But a breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a hardware store on the edge of town. The owner had seen the news coverage and decided to review footage from the days leading up to Thomas's disappearance. What he found changed everything. On the evening of June 24th, two familiar faces walked into the store, David and Mark Granger. Surveillance footage showed them pushing a cart filled with specific items: a large roll of plastic sheeting, heavy duty, trash bags, duct tape, a box of gloves, and a hacksaw. None of the items raised concern on their own, but together they painted a disturbing picture. The timestamp on the footage matched the suspected time frame of Thomas's murder. Detectives used this footage to request search warrants for both brothers' homes. What they found was deeply unsettling. In Mark's garage, a forensic team uncovered blood traces beneath a large area rug. Though it had been partially cleaned, luminol tests lit up the concrete floor in several places. In one corner, an old metal workbench showed signs of rust and deep scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. A hacksaw matching the one purchased at the store was found hanging on the wall. Tests later confirmed that fragments of human tissue were embedded in the blade at David's apartment. Investigators focused on his vehicle. A forensic sweep of the trunk revealed fibers matching the duffel bags found at the lake. Even more telling, the car's GPS system had recorded a trip to Lake Briar on the night of June 25th, just after midnight. David hadn't mentioned going anywhere near the lake when questioned earlier. Now, it was clear he had lied. With this evidence in hand, police brought both brothers in for questioning. Neither seemed surprised when they were arrested. What did surprise investigators, however, was how quickly their stories fell apart. Each brother pointed the finger at the other. David claimed Mark had orchestrated the whole thing, using him as muscle and promising him a cut of the money from the house sale. He said he went along with it out of fear. Mark, on the other hand, told a different story. He said David was angry at Thomas for years and had finally snapped. According to Mark, he only helped clean up the aftermath because he was afraid of what David might do to him next. Detectives were now faced with a twisted puzzle. Both brothers admitted involvement, but their stories were tangled in contradiction. Forensic evidence confirmed they had both participated, but it couldn't reveal who had delivered the fatal blow. The deeper investigators dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a spontaneous act of violence. It was something planned, cold, calculated, and carried out by two brothers who had once shared the same childhood, but now shared something far darker. The interrogation room became a pressure cooker, and it didn't take long before one of the brothers cracked. Mark Granger, the youngest, sat silently for hours before finally breaking. When he began to speak, his words came slowly, without emotion. What he described wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was a plan that had been building quietly for weeks. He said it started when Thomas mentioned selling their parents' old home, the house they all grew up in. That conversation reopened years of resentment. Mark claimed he and David had felt pushed aside for years, treated like afterthoughts while Thomas made the big decisions. The house, he said, was the last thread tying them to their family history. Losing it felt like losing everything. According to Mark, David was the one who came up with the plan. He told Mark they could confront Thomas, scare him into signing over the property, and finally get what was owed to them. But the plan quickly spiraled out of control. Mark said that on the night of June 24th, David invited Thomas over to help fix a generator in the garage. Thomas had no idea it was a setup. While Thomas bent over the equipment, David struck him from behind with a wrench. Mark insisted he panicked, claiming he never meant to be involved in murder. But once it happened, he felt trapped. Mark detailed how they wrapped the body in plastic, cleaned the garage as best they could, and used a saw to dismember the remains to make transport easier. He spoke about it as if describing someone else's actions, distant and numb. The brothers stored the body overnight before driving it to Lake Briar under cover of darkness. They chose the lake because it was secluded and familiar, a place they used to visit as kids. The irony didn't escape investigators. When David was presented with Mark's version of events, his reaction was cold and defiant. He denied being the mastermind and accused Mark of twisting the truth. According to David, it was Mark who had reached out first, furious about the house and desperate for a solution. He claimed Mark had the garage prepared before David even arrived that night. David admitted helping after the fact, but insisted he wasn't present when Thomas was killed. His story shifted details just enough to cast doubt on Mark's confession. Both brothers agreed on certain facts, the tools, the plastic, the trip to the lake, but their accounts diverged on the most crucial moment. Who struck the fatal blow? Despite hours of questioning, neither would budge from their story. The physical evidence confirmed their involvement, but it couldn't clarify the order of events. What became clear, though, was that both men had played a role in a cover-up, and both had lied repeatedly. Their bond as brothers had fractured completely, each willing to sacrifice the other to save themselves. In trying to hold on to the past, they had destroyed their future and taken a life in the process. The trial of David and Mark Granger began in early January, 6 months after Thomas's remains were discovered. The courtroom was packed on the first day, filled with townspeople who once saw the Grangers as just another family from Birch Lane. Now, they were watching a family tragedy unfold in real time. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous detail: surveillance footage, forensic analysis, GPS records, and the chilling confessions from both brothers. They painted a picture of calculated betrayal, rooted in long-held resentment and greed. Each brother had turned on the other, and the jury heard both conflicting accounts. Mark's confession was read in full, alongside the evidence found in his garage. Photographs of blood splatters, saw marks, and plastic sheeting left little to the imagination. David's phone records, vehicle data, and purchase history added another layer of damning evidence. Though their stories clashed, the facts placed both of them at the center of the crime. What no one could say for certain was who had swung the wrench first. The truth of that moment remained buried beneath layers of lies and blame. In their defense, David's lawyer argued that his client had acted under duress, manipulated by a more calculating younger brother. Mark's attorney pushed the opposite narrative, that his client had been a frightened bystander caught in a spiral of violence he never intended to be part of. But the jury saw through the shifting stories. They saw the planning, the cleanup, the concealment. They saw two brothers who could have chosen to stop, call for help, or walk away, but instead worked together to erase a man's existence. After 2 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Both David and Mark were found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge spoke firmly during sentencing, calling the crime a disturbing betrayal of family bonds and a brutal act, born from selfishness and unresolved bitterness. Back in Ashton Hills, the outcome did little to ease the town's discomfort. People passed by the Granger home with unease. The house on Birch Lane, once a symbol of the Granger family's roots, now stood empty, its windows boarded, its garden overgrown. Some neighbors said they still saw the porch light flicker at night, left on out of habit or perhaps as a ghostly reminder of what once was. Thomas Granger was laid to rest in a small, quiet ceremony attended by a handful of friends and distant relatives. No brothers, no apologies, just a grave marked by a simple headstone and a few flowers. His story faded from headlines, but it left a scar on the town that wouldn't easily heal. What made the crime so chilling wasn't just the violence. It was the silence that had built between three brothers over the years, the bitterness that festered until it turned deadly. In the end, blood ties had not been enough to hold them together. They were broken, completely and irreversibly.